Okay. This class has been a little in flux, I guess. Neil asked me to pitch hit for him a few weeks ago. Gary pitched hit for him last week. I'm always glad to teach. I know the first couple of verses of James chapter 3. It's always a humbling thing and a somewhat scary thing to teach. But I'm always glad to do it in this class where there's so many knowledgeable people. But I'm always a little nervous. Joyce sensed that when we were leaving the house. And she said, "Don't worry, you'll be okay." And that's great encouragement from a wife of 49 years, is it not? And then what'd you say? Everybody in the room knows you're not as good as Neil. So, no problem. No problem. No problem. So, we go from there. All right. Gary got us deeply into chapter 5 of Matthew. This is a study of Matthew, and I've titled the lesson, "Think on These Things." I borrowed that from Philippians 4:8, I believe it is, where Paul tells the Philippians, think on these things, and he lists a number of things he wants them to think about. Well, Jesus didn't say that anywhere in the Sermon on the Mount, but boy, if the things he said in the Sermon on the Mount and the things that he did shortly after the Sermon on the Mount didn't get everybody's attention to make them think on those things, then they weren't paying attention very well. Survey, I promised Neil I would do all that I could to get through chapters 6, 7, and 8 of Matthew so we could catch up a little bit. So we are not going to do a verse-by-verse study by any stretch of the imagination. We may focus in on a couple of verses, but we're going to kind of do a panoramic view of the last two chapters. We break this into chapters, of course. It's chapters 6 and 7 of the Sermon on the Mount. The last two of the three, and then the following chapter, 8, the after effects of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I've titled this, Jesus' great lesson continues or concludes, and the evidence increases, and then the response. Let's start with chapter 6. And again, we're not doing verse-by-verse study, so let me tell you the first thing I want us to look at in chapter 6 is that Jesus throws out what I will refer to as some kingdom conflicts. He's effectively saying that if you're in the kingdom, if you really want to be in the kingdom, then there's some things that are going to potentially create conflicts for you, and you need to know about them. And the first one he talks about is a potential conflict in the fact that there is both a correct way and an incorrect way to practice what God expects of us, and he does that in several respects. He touches on several respects, but they're kind of far-reaching on those because the respects he touched on, they all touch several bases himself. The first thing he says is that, okay, in general, here's some things you need to know about how not to demonstrate righteous living. I read in my preparation something that I probably knew inherently, but it refreshed my memory on it. A commentary writer said that the Grecian actors of the first century, the time that this was spoken, and we know he's talking to a Jewish audience, but the Grecian actors were a big thing of the time. And if they wanted to represent that there was somebody else, they wore a mask that was as close as they could to represent that person. You know, kind of like if we go to a play to see something about Abraham Lincoln, we expect that character that's leading that role to be tall and to have some hair and long face and perhaps a beard, and to talk with a certain type of voice of authority like Lincoln did. But in that day and time, they just wore a mask which was designed to represent somebody that they were not. And what Jesus is saying is, I don't want you to hide behind some kind of mask. I don't want you to think that you can put a mask on that tells people you are somebody when behind that mask you're really somebody else. You just can't do that. And he mentions a couple of, really more than a couple of ways to do that. First, he says, supporting the unfortunate. He has a little discussion. There's a lot more in the New Testament, of course, about this, but he talks about supporting the unfortunate. Now, you and I both know, we've seen many examples of this, that praises ring out for people of considerable means who give millions to charity. And it always, I'm an accountant by trade, and I've seen tax returns of wealthy people over the years, but it always ingrains me to see somebody that's worth billions of dollars and to give a couple $100,000 to a charity. That's fine. It's like me buying you a cup of coffee for 45 cents. But that gets praise. And not that that's not a good thing. They need to be doing that. They need to be supporting those charities. And some of those charities they support, I'm sure, are things that God would smile about, God would be happy about, sometimes not. However, in reality, the church is mostly supported by folks who are somewhat humble, and they sacrifice to support God's causes. So be it. That's the way it ought to be. And I know some people, even some people in this room, that make some sacrifices to support charitable causes. And I don't see anything that is broadcast about that. The one he dwells on, though, is a different one. And I can't see the screen. I'm going to turn around and look. Praying. He spends some time talking about praying. And this is the Lord's Prayer. And I don't want us to delve deeply into that. But let's remember that the Pharisees, and this may be, I'm not sure. I just thought of this an hour or so ago when I was doing my final prep. This may be the first time when Jesus got under the skin of the Pharisees. Now, he did that on a pretty regular basis. This may be the first time because they had a practice of praying in public places, praying to be seen. And Jesus says that we must guard against praying if our purpose is to be seen. Now, he doesn't condemn praying in public. We know that Jesus prayed in public. Jesus also prayed alone in the mountain. But he says that if you're doing it for the particular purpose of being seen and getting some kind of recognition because you can lead or are willing to pray, then you're not doing what we should. You're not practicing the things that demonstrate righteous living. And then I do want to say this, that I believe that his points, thank you very much, his points are very sure. He's saying that we absolutely prohibit, or he absolutely prohibits, grandstanding piety. If you want to grandstand, then fine, go grandstand about something else other than your religion. He just doesn't like that. He says, I don't want any theater. Theater's not the place, or this is not the place for theater. And I don't want any trumpets blowing when you're supporting the unfortunate and when you're praying, because not only the motive, but the method is important. All right, now you've got a handout, and you're going to help me a little bit because I've got, I think, 10 questions in this, and that works out pretty well when I get ready to grade you tonight, because this is kind of an open book test, and everybody gets the same grade. So somebody's got to come up with an answer. Let's look at question 1. True or false? Jesus taught that we, Christians, are forbidden to do righteous, that is, God-approved things, and be seen while doing so, or for it to become known from others' actions. Is that a true statement or a false statement? Somebody here, I heard it. False. Why is it false? Why is it false?
We're not forbidden to do it. We're forbidden to do it so it will be seen.
All right. Wanting to be seen doing it is what Jesus is saying is just not right. The condition of one's heart is the determinant factor. Why are we doing it? And if the answer to that is, well, I want people to know that I'm doing it, then that's a no-no. Okay, question 2 on your outline. Now, we're familiar with the Lord's Prayer, at least most of us in the room are. And we're not going to read it, we're not going to recite it, but I want you to tell me in one word or a very few words, a phrase, describe the Lord's Prayer. I heard something. All-encompassing. All-encompassing brings in things. In fact, I think it's maybe the first 3 things he mentions are things about God. It points toward God, and then down toward us, things to help us out. He kind of breaks it down. A little reverence in that. What else? Complete, but what? Sorry. Concise, brief is what I was looking for. So concise, yes. So we don't have to have these prayers that last all day, and they don't have to be the Lord's Prayer. They don't have to be verbatim like this. He didn't say this when you pray. He gave us an example of what an effective prayer ought to be. So we want prayers that are focused. We want prayers that embrace all the right things. We want prayers that express the condition of one's hearts, and they, of course, can sometimes petition for specific needs, and, of course, they should be reverent. Now, he mentions in the verses that follow where we are two things that should have resonated with the folks that are hearing this for the first time. He mentions fasting and wealth. We don't do much fasting today. I know some people that occasionally fast. It's just not a common practice in the Western world. I suppose it's more so in other places, but it's the same principle as just before, and that principle is don't do something to be seen. Maybe in this case it's don't not do something just to be seen. So don't go about fasting if you're just trying to make a point that you want somebody else to see. Acts of self-denial must be for the eyes of God and God alone. The comment he makes about wealth, that should even resonate with us. We're living in the wealthiest nation in the world, but it's not a condemnation of riches. It does not condemn things like, and you can't even make a stretch, make it condemn things like a retirement savings account or insurance or other savings account. In fact, if you read Proverbs, you'll find a lot of support for some of those things. But rather, it's the improper use of riches. Earthly treasures are going to perish. We know that. Wealth used for God's purposes accomplishes two things, though. You know, some people, for inappropriate reasons, can use their wealth to do a number of things that will really benefit others, and that happens all the time. But wealth or riches that are used to accomplish God's purposes satisfy two needs or achieve two objectives. What would they be? Well, let's mention one of them. It's going to help somebody. But what else is it going to do? Lay up for yourselves. Yeah, it's going to help you. Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven. So it's going to, that's the way you do something that benefits you. You lay up treasure in heaven. Question 3 on your outline. How do verses 22 and 23, somebody tell me briefly what that is. Look at that and tell me, that's the eye is the lamp of the body? Is that what it is? The light of the body? Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Verses 22 and 23, how does that fit into the discussion? Is it merely an abrupt subject-changing transition in Jesus' discourse? You know, it seems like if you read what comes after that, he's kind of changing the subject a little bit. What is this business about the lamp of the body? What is this? Where's he going with that? What's the point I'm supposed to get from that? Okay, all right. And if we're focusing on, I mean, it's like a diseased eye. If I've got a diseased eye, I got one that I'm going to have cataract surgery on in 6 weeks or so. But if I've got a diseased eye, I'm not going to see very well. If any light comes in, it's not going to let me see what I need to see, at least as well as I need to. And so he's saying that if you take in the wrong things, if you see the wrong things, then only see darkness, you're going to visualize darkness. It's going to kind of be, if you don't take in the right things, you're not going to get very far. Diseased eyes can't see, and it won't even see wrong that a person has before them. Yeah. Yeah, good comments, Mike. Good comments. Okay. Let's go on. Who do you trust? This is still in chapter 6, verses 22 through 34. Who do you trust, or in what do you trust? I've just mentioned that these first two verses, 22 and 23, are transition verses. Then I think he goes to an application. And his application is we cannot simultaneously achieve two conflicting objectives. There's a story going on in a newspaper in another state about an attorney who was representing somebody who was in conflict against his best friend, who was also his college roommate, also an attorney. So he's representing somebody that's in conflict with his best friend. What gives, is that the right way to do things? Well, no. And of course that wasn't made known. Jesus is very clear in that application. We can't serve two masters. We can't simultaneously achieve two objectives that are clearly in conflict. I want to look now at 33 and 34. Now, if you mark anything at all from this discussion, I want you to think that, or to know that I believe that these verses are key verses in the New Testament. Earthly needs will be satisfied, but there is a condition to this. Question 4 on your outline. Seek ye first. What are the two conditions of all these things shall be added to you? The two conditions. Seek it first. Do that first. Seek it first. Then what else? Closely related to it. Matthew 22:37. Anybody know what that says without looking it up? What's the first and greatest commandment of the law? Of the Lord thy God. Yep. So it's not just seeking the kingdom first, but going all in to do that. We can't say, well, okay, I'm going to do the things that God expects of me. But if I've got a conflict, if I got something else I need to do, I'll lay that aside and I'll pick that back up on Sunday and I'll start all over again. Or we can't say that I'm going to do the best I can, but you know what? If it wears me out, I'm going to back off a little bit. I'm going to slow down a little bit. Jesus expects more of that, more from us than that. And he tells the Pharisees here and the others that are listening here. Okay, move to chapter 7 now. I like chapter 7 of the Sermon on the Mount, and here he starts out with a very clear condemnation of something that's going on. He talks about people's actions and their words. He talks about motes and beams. He talks about dogs and pigs. Now, some of that may have been confusing to some of those people, but I think if they had thought about it a little bit, maybe not so. Matthew 7:1, judge not that you be not judged. I read 2 or 3 newspapers, sometimes 4 on some days, and about twice, maybe 3 times a year, there'll be a letter to the editor where this verse is brought up, where they're condemning somebody because they did something or said something that was judgmental. And they say, what about Matthew 7:1, judge not that you be not judged. So my question to you, is that what he's really saying? Judge not that you be not judged, all right?
They forget what verse 2 says.
Say that again?
They forget what verse 2 says.
They forget what verse 2 says. Go ahead and tell us, Nat, what verse 2 says.
Starting at verse 2. For with the judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you.
Okay, it's the same principle. What's that biblical principle that really is there? I heard you. Righteous judgment. Okay, yeah, I'm fine with that. But I want you to look at this. This is question 7 on your. Well, let me go back a little bit on that. Let me go back on that a little bit. Look at. Let me find it on my notes. Sorry. Look at 7:15, chapter 7, verse 15. What does Jesus say there? What's the first phrase there? Beware of false prophets. What does that require? Making a judgment call. Look at 7:20. What does that say? By their fruits you will know. What does that require? Making a judgment call. Go back a couple of pages, one page. Look at 6:8. Start of the Sermon on the Mount. What does Jesus say? Do not be like them, which requires what? Judgment about they are. So there's no conflict between 7:1 and all these other verses, because 7:1 doesn't say don't make judgment calls. Now flip over to John 7:24 real quickly. Just a few pages over your Bible. I think it's worthwhile that we read this. John 7:24. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So we see that judging itself is not condemned, but it has to be made with an understanding of all of the biblical principles. What do our good teachers say about looking at a verse, in a particular verse? What do we not do? Or what do we do? Consider it in context. Yeah, consider it in context. So you have to look at the whole context of what Jesus is trying to say here. He's not condemning judgment, but he says it has to be made with an understanding of the Bible and has to be a righteous judgment. Hypocritical judgment. Yeah. Well, he makes that clear, Chuck, in the mote and the beam discussion, does he not? A mote or a speck, beam or a plank. He says, don't find yourself condemning somebody because they got a small mote in their eye when you're walking around with a 6x8 that's about 12 feet in your own eye. It's a relative thing. Look at question 6 now. Let me cover that right quick. What well-known and often quoted Bible principle is really in play here? Galatians 6:7. What does Paul say to the Galatians? Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Yeah. I think we have to keep in mind that if we're making those harsh, cutting, inappropriate judgments, we should expect some of that ourselves. It takes a disciplined approach to keep, even in circumstances where it may seem the right thing to do. It is never the right thing to do. He talks about dogs and swine, and I have to think that the people that heard this message, when he mentioned dogs and swine, I have to think that they got a little bit more out of that than perhaps we today get out of that. A lot of people in this room have dogs that stay in the house all the time. A lot of people love their dogs. How were dogs viewed in the time of Jesus? What about it? Were they house pets? No. No, they were just, they were unclean, first of all. You just didn't want to be around a dog. And so consequently, there weren't any such things as friendly dogs. Most dogs were snarling and snapping at you all the time. Jesus is effectively saying if you're trying to instill good things in somebody that has an unclean mind like the dogs of the day, then you're wasting your time. It's not holy to do that. Consider things that are holy. Swine also were unclean. You can't imagine the circumstance of people casting pearls before swine. What are they going to do? Casting pearls down before pigs, what's going to happen? Are they going to value them? Yeah, they're going to trample them under the feet, or they're going to eat them. But they're not going to make good use of them. It's useless to try to do that. The attitude of some people when they're presented, exposed to God's Word carefully and completely, comprehensively, they just are going to reject it. And so we need to be cautious about that. Let's go on. I think I'm behind on it. I thought I'd be able to see the slide up there, but that's post-cataract surgery, I guess. Uh-oh, I did it wrong. Okay. All right. Asking and receiving. The golden rule, Jesus' invitation, and be watchful for those in disguise. Verses 7 through 11. Critical verses. 3, it's in verse 7. I believe there are 3, what I'll call action verbs in there when we're talking about asking something of God. What are those action verbs? What are they? Ask is one, seek, and knock. I'm reminded of my dad, who years ago, he's been deceased for a number of years, but he had a friend was named Mr. Pig, and he and Mr. Pig were big buddies, and Dad used to go over to his house really early in the morning, and they did everything together. They raised their gardens together, and they hunted possums together and all that kind of stuff. But he would go over to Mr. Pig's house, and he would ask first. He would say, "Pig, Pig." Mr. Pig, hadn't come out yet to get to his garden or to go to a little shop or whatever. And if Dad couldn't get him to respond, then he would just go peep in the back door. He would diligently look for Mr. Pig. And then, if that didn't work, what did he do now? He knocked on the door, and Miss Pig came to the door and said, "Yeah, he's putting these overalls on," or whatever. So Dad had that asking and seeking and knocking routine down. Jesus said that we need to ask what we want of God. We need to be earnestly seeking it. And then even if we're hindered, we need to be persistent. We need to keep knocking. And those 3 qualities should be the thread that runs through all of our prayers. Verse 12, he's talking about the golden rule, or he gives us the golden rule, or what we refer to as the golden rule. He says this is the law of the prophets. That echoes really what he has said back a couple of chapters earlier, 5:17. I didn't come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. And now he's giving kind of a continuation of that discussion. I like his discussion in 13, 14, and 21 through 23. All of this whole discussion is a discourse about the kingdom of heaven. And we've heard how many sermons about the wide way and the narrow way. Understand that the people of that day all lived in, or at least for the most part, lived in fortified cities. There were gates. The main entrance to the city, or main entrances, would have wide gates or wide paths that led to wide gates. And most of the people went that way. However, there were also narrow paths that went to more private entrances. And how could you get in those doors to that walled city? How could you get in those doors? You had to be recognized, and you also had to be something else. You had to be invited. You had to be known. You had to be known. And so what Jesus is saying, don't be the person that goes through that gate because that wide gate, that wide path, and get to that wide gate because at some point that door is going to be closed, but you have your own private entrance. That's the narrow path that leads to the small gate, and when you knock on that gate, somebody's going to open that door and let you in. We wonder how can so many people be so wrong in the things that they preach and teach. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know this. Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven, and nobody, wherever there's kingdoms, in those days and the centuries that followed, nobody who disobeyed the king could claim citizenship in the kingdom. Faithful obedience to the dictates of the king was imperative, or were imperative. Many individuals today, many ministers are deceiving the folks that are hearing them, and many people are deceiving their own selves. Verses 15 and 20, fruits. Fruits refers not just to deeds done, but to the doctrine professed and practiced, or practiced. You might write in your notes Revelation 22, 18, and 19. We won't take time to read it. The church elders make sure that the people who are representing the church in a public way, that is from the pulpit, are saying the right things. They're well schooled to do that, well prepared to do that. But don't forget, it's an individual responsibility. How many people are packing pews in religious organizations today? It cannot be number 2. can it? That's number 1 or 0? That's 1? Okay. All right. All right, thank you. Okay, let's move on. Actions matter more than words. In 7:24 through 29, Jesus is talking about the reward. In 24:25, this is the discussion about the building of the house. And in 26:27, he's talking about the risk. Now, you and I both know that the difference in the house that's being built here that he's describing is not something that you visibly see. The houses might look exactly the same. It's the foundation on which they're built. If you build a house on shifting sands, it's sure to collapse. Verses 28 and 29, and I've read these verses a number of times. I'm always somewhat stunned at what the reaction to the people has been over what Jesus has said, and what the reaction is not very much later when they're saying crucify him. The scope and the depth of what he's just taught them can leave no impression other than the impression that Matthew tells us is here: astonishment. I'm not surprised. They should have been surprised either. And why is that? Well, go back to Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. Turn there, but in Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6 through 16, Paul says, for who has known the mind of the Lord? Now, we both know that Jesus was not just a man standing before them, but he was the Son of God. So the mind that these things are coming out of and the things that they're hearing are coming from the mind of God. Sure, it was astonishing. Sure, it should have resonated with them, and for some it did, but it didn't do it very well. Question 7. Now, I do want to make sure we get this one covered. Verse 29, Matthew tells us Jesus taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. Think about the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Where else in the sermon, in Jesus' own words, do we have affirmation that he spoke with authority? I'll give you a hint. It's in chapter 5. At least 5 times I found. What does he say? 5:20. First one. 5:20. What does he say? Somebody find 5:20. I say to you, 5:20, 5:22, 5:26, where are the others? 28 and 32. 20, 22, 26, 28, and 32. Jesus says, I say to you, no such claim could be made unless it is made with divine authority. And from this point on, all Jesus really does is establish the fact that he does have divine authority. He said the things that should have resonated with them, and then he proved what he said. And that all starts with chapter 8. Chapter 8 has the first of a series, or first few of a series, of clear and convincing evidences of Jesus' authority. There are more witnesses, there are more evidence, and the first of them are these 3 life-changing events. After Jesus comes down from the mountain, the Sermon on the Mount is over. There's probably less people, almost certainly less people. He encounters this leper. The leper is cleansed. Question 8 in your outline. What's the significance of the leper's statement to Jesus? If you are willing, you can make me clean. If you are willing, you can make me clean. What's the significance of that? If you are willing, you can make me clean. At least what? He knew Jesus was able. He knew Jesus was able. So, Jesus, if you're willing, you can do it. I know you can do it. So he expressed some faith that's often overlooked there. He did know Jesus could do that. Some people's faith becomes somewhat shattered because God doesn't do something that they think he should do, or that he ought to do for them, or for something that they believe is important. Don't let your faith be shattered because God's not specifically answering your questions. God has his own timetable and his own agenda. Question 9. Now, he goes to, meets the centurion. Give me another minute, please. The centurion was certain that Jesus could heal. This is question 9. The centurion was certain Jesus could heal his servant if he would only speak a word, and this caused Jesus to marvel. How is this different from Martha's comment to Jesus on his delay in coming after learning of the severe sickness of her brother Lazarus? What did she say to Jesus? If you'd only been here, my brother wouldn't have died. What does the centurion say? Speak a word. You do not have to be physically present. When I read this, studied this a day or two ago, I thought, we all know from Acts 10 that the first Gentile convert was Cornelius. This guy may be the first non-Jew believer. He certainly was believing what he had heard about Jesus. Okay, let me get to question 10, and then I'll let you go. 2 times in the Old Testament, or New Testament, it mentions Jesus marveled in response to the occurrence. One is here, Matthew 8:10. He's marveling about this centurion's faith. What's the other occasion? Do you remember? When did he marvel? When? There's a lack of faith. There's a lack of faith at Nazareth. He marveled at the lack of the Jewish people having faith. So the contrast I see here is, it's only 2 times in the New Testament it says Jesus marveled. One, it's a non-Jew that has faith. The rest of the time it's a whole bunch of Jews who have no faith. There's a message there. The gospel is for us. I appreciate your patience in listening to me. Thank you very much. Next week, what is next week? It's October something. I think Neil's back next week. Thank you.